So Rachel, thank you very much for accepting this interview. You're the first author of the study, Can Agroecology Improve Food Security? First of all, can you introduce yourself in a few words?
Certainly, and thanks for inviting me for this interview. My name is Rachel Beznerr Kerr, and I'm a professor at Cornell University in the United States. And I am a sociologist with a background also in soil science.
And so right now you are working on a research project in Malawi. Can you tell us a few words about it?
Certainly. I have arrived in Malawi a few weeks ago. I have a long-term collaboration here in Malawi. So I'm actually involved in several research projects with them. The organization is a farmer-led organization called Soils, Food and Healthy Communities Organization. And they're a nonprofit farmer-led organization that does research on agroecology and community-based strategies for improving food security and livelihoods, but also addressing questions of social inequality.
So let's talk a little bit about the studies that brought me to contact you. So in this study you reviewed all the research published between 1998 and 2019 that showed a relationship between agroecology and food safety or nutrition. So can you tell me about the impulse of this work? What made you go on this particular review of studies?
Certainly. The impulse initially came actually because I was a member of the author team of a United Nations report on agroecology and its potential to address food security and nutrition, as well as other approaches beyond agroecology. This was for the Committee for World Food Security, and it was a 10-author team. And so we decided we wanted to do a review to really look at the evidence over the last 2 decades. There hadn't been any systematic review of the evidence for agroecology improving food security and nutrition. And I knew from my own research here in Malawi and also in Tanzania that there was evidence, at least from my own research, but there wasn't any sort of systematic review of the literature more broadly. It's a very common question when people are asking about agroecology. There's strong evidence in terms of benefits for ecosystem services and biodiversity. But there's a lot of skepticism about the viability of agroecology in terms of addressing food security and nutrition. So we focused on food security and nutrition as our primary outcomes.
So you gathered several thousands results of research, then you filtered step by step the bulk of studies that you focused on. And in the end, what were the questions you were asking to this bulk of research studies?
We wanted to understand what was the strength of evidence for agroecology improving food security and nutrition. And we wanted to understand if it made a difference, whether it was just one practice or a suite of practices, and then what kind of practice. And we looked, so we grouped the agroecology practices in terms of different categories of practice, such as soil management versus pest management, for example. But we also considered the social dimensions of agroecology, because agroecology differs from other agricultural approaches in its emphasis on paying attention to social inequality and also ensuring that there's co-production of knowledge, that farmers are really actively involved in experimentation and sharing knowledge, and also things like farmer cooperatives so that farmers get a fair share from a price of a crop once they've finished growing it. So we wanted to include those dimensions of agroecology and not just specific practices.
And what are the main results, the main answers to this question that you've found?
Yeah, so we found that there is strong evidence that agroecology improves food security and nutrition. The majority of studies, 78%, found evidence of positive outcomes from the use of agroecological practices in low and middle income countries. So there were very few studies that were in high income countries that looked at food security and nutrition outcomes. And most of the studies were looking at the food security and nutrition of producer households, but some of them also looked at consumers of agroecological products. But there was strong evidence of food security and nutrition being improved when there was an increased use of agroecological practices. And the more practices that were used, the more likely there would be a positive impact on food security and nutrition. So those were some of our important findings.
So this positive relation between agroecological practices and food security is what are the mechanisms at stake? What makes it relatively to a conventional model and improve into food safety or nutrition?
One of the mechanisms is through increased diversity of production. And one of the most common practices was increasing the number of crops and animals that a farmer had on their farm. And so some of it was increased consumption of those products or sale of those products, getting a better price for those products, and reducing the risk from having only one crop for sale, but being able to have more choice in terms of when to sell. That was another way that farmers could increase income and then have more money available for purchasing food. But there were other mechanisms as well, things like improving the soil fertility. And so having during drought years or poor rainfall years, the crop doing better under those conditions, and so improving food security that way. So there were sort of indirect effects of the agroecological practices that led to improvements in outcome. And then there were some of the social organization and social dimensions. So farmers being able to gain benefits from being in a cooperative, for example. So there was a number of different mechanisms. In terms of the difference, if you are focused only on productivity, one of the differences, I mean, again, it would vary by study, but some of the differences include you're not spending as much money on inputs if you are drawing on improving your soil fertility, so you don't have to purchase fertilizer or using natural methods for dealing with pests and disease. So then you're not spending money on pesticides and other toxic inputs. So that reduces the cost of farming, which can increase the amount of money that you have at the end, again, for having a wider range of food sources, greater dietary diversity. So that's one difference, is reducing the cost of inputs and having greater stability over the long term. So if you've improved your soil, I've mentioned that your farm might do better under drought conditions, which means that you may have, you are likely to have greater stability of yield over a longer period of time. So there's a range of different benefits that really vary from the conventional approach to agriculture.
So would you say that an agroecological model is not only something that you can pick and choose from, but something that you have to approach globally as systematically?
That's one of the fundamental differences between an agroecological approach and a conventional approach. So a conventional approach is really, its end goal is productivity of the crop or animal, but an agroecological approach is really a holistic approach that is trying to look at the whole system under which you're growing food. And so it's paying attention to soil quality and water quality and energy and biodiversity in your system as part of that strategy. And so it's not really agroecological if you're just replacing synthetic fertilizer with compost, for example. That's maybe the starting point, but in order for it to really transition to an agroecological system, you have to do many different aspects to make it sort of a full agroecological system.
And among these aspects, you have also the social organization, meaning that is not only agroecology is not only about changing cropping techniques, but also about how you organize the work around the field, around the culture in general. What is the connection then between the social organization around the food system and food security and nutrition, the specific topics of your study?
So in the case of producers, if there's greater attention to equity, if that's a component of the approach that's being taken, then for example, if there's greater equity within households around the distribution of food, around the distribution of work between men and women, for example, or if there's attention to equity in a community or regional level in terms of people's access to land, that will increase the likelihood of them benefiting from an agroecological approach. If you're just growing food in a more environmentally friendly way, but you're not changing anything around people's access to food and fair wages and things like that, then you're not actually going to affect food security and nutrition. You're just going to affect the environmental components of food production. Let's take the example of fair price for the food that farmers are growing. So most farmers, almost all farmers, are involved in the cash economy. They're not growing everything and just eating it. They need money for school fees for their children. They need money for healthcare, or they need money for clothing and soap. And so if they are growing it in a very ecological way, but then they go to sell it on the market and they're selling it to one company, and that company is giving them very little money, they might not have enough money for their living expenses. So they may have to sell most of their crop. Even if it's produced in a very ecological way, they themselves may be highly food insecure as a result. So the unfairness of the system, which is highly concentrated in a few companies buying from that farmer, or one company, which is how the current food system operates for many farmers, means that that farmer is likely to be food insecure. And in fact, around the globe, the majority of smallholders experience food insecurity, even though they produce a substantial amount of the food around the world.
So as a general conclusion, let's say answer the question that is asked by your article. So can agroecology improve food nutrition, food security and nutrition? I would say on a global scale. I mean, both for low income or middle income countries, but also for higher income countries such as in the European Union.
So I think our study answers the question, yes, for low and middle income countries, but there is limited research on whether agroecology addresses food security and nutrition in high income countries for food insecure households. There is a growing interest in kind of urban agroecology in high income countries, places like the United States, Canada, different parts of Europe, where you have low-income households who are interested in urban agroecology as a means to both for income and for consumption. There aren't many studies that look at the impact on food security and nutrition in those contexts. There are, I think I know of one. So there's research to be done for that kind of agroecology. But in terms of low and middle income countries, I think our study answers definitively, yes, it can improve food security and nutrition in those contexts.
Can you tell us about the 10 years for agroecology?
Yes, so it wasn't included in our review because it's not a peer-reviewed paper, but it's an excellent report, and I have looked at it for the high-level panel of experts report and for other research, and I've been in touch with the authors. That study looked at the potential for agroecology for Europe to convert to an agroecological system over 10 years, and whether it would affect the amount of food available and even for export, so consumed in Europe and for export. And they found that it was possible to convert to an agroecological system. And it would allow them to continue to export as well as feed their populations. So I'm looking forward to the peer-reviewed paper. I understand they intend to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal.
All right. So thank you very much for answering these questions. We will put the link for your studies in the description of the video. And I wish you the best for your research in Malawi and for the next works that you're going to work on.
Thank you so much, and good luck with your work and important campaign. And it's nice meeting you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too.